So this section is 1.7, properties of real numbers and simplifying expressions. So I already have a video in the classroom called Variables and Expressions where I go over the simplifying part. So this part I'm focusing on the properties of real numbers. And so it's best to probably watch this one first and then doing the variables and expressions. But if you do them in the other order, it's not really a huge deal. And I think in my video on solving that I have in the classroom, I go over these same properties again. So there's going to be some reinforcement, but I figured, okay, let me focus on the properties and kind of how they work so that you have an idea of why we're allowed to do a lot of what we do. So let's start with the commutative property. So the name comes from the word commutation, which is not a word that I have ever heard somebody use in real life, but it is a real word. And so according to dictionary.com, it means the act of substituting one thing for another. And then it could also be exchange. So the exchange is the key idea with this commutative property, is we're basically flip-flopping or exchanging positions where things are. So we have the commutative property of addition and then one for multiplication. So the one with addition, if you have A plus B, you can basically flip-flop those and write those as B plus A. So you can rearrange the order that things are added. So that's where that word commutation comes in, because they're sort of exchanging which one is in which place. The commutative property of multiplication does the same thing, but you're just multiplying. So if you have A times B, that's the same thing as doing B times A. So the order there, the order that you multiply doesn't really matter. Just like the order that you add doesn't really matter. Whether you have one plus the other plus the one, the order doesn't make a difference in your final answer. So I'm going to go through some examples of demonstrating this. So we're going to use the commutative property to rearrange the following. So I've got top left, we have 6 plus 7. So 6 plus 7 is 13. So I'm going to just actually give the answer here. But the commutative property basically means you're flip-flopping the position. So instead of writing 6 plus 7, we can write 7 plus 6. So that's using the commutative property. We're just rearranging it. And the answer is the same. 7 plus 6 is 13. 6 plus 7 is 13. That answer doesn't change, and that's why we're allowed to do this. So that is the commutative property. We're just rearranging the order. Now this is the commutative property of addition. Now on the right here, I have 5 minus 10. That's subtraction. If it's subtraction, you cannot just flip-flop those. You have to rewrite it as addition first. So subtraction is the same as adding a negative. So first I would have to write this as 5 plus negative 10. Once you turn subtraction into addition, then you can use the commutative property flip-flop. So that's the same thing as saying negative 10 plus 5. So that is the commutative property.
So that means that the commutative property of multiplication is going to be division.
That would be doing the that's sort of. We're just rearranging the order. So like 4 times 5. If it's multiplication, I can just rearrange the order. I get the same answer as if I did 5 times 4. So you don't have to change the multiplication to division. And you don't have to change addition to subtraction. Those can stay the way they are. But if we have division, we do have to change that to multiplication because we only have commutative properties of addition and multiplication. So if I have division, like 9 divided by 3, I have to first rewrite that as multiplication. So that's multiplying by the reciprocal. So that would be 9 times 1 over 3. Once I rewrite that as multiplication, then I can use the property, the commutative property, to flip-flop them. which would be 1/3 times 9. So we're just kind of rearranging which one comes first. But if you have subtraction or division, you have to rewrite it before you can rearrange. Are there any questions on these 4 examples? Okay. So our next property is called the associative property. So the name of this property comes from the word associate or associate, the verb actually. So if you look that up on dictionary.com, it means to connect or bring into relation, to enter into a union, unite, to basically group things together. So this associative property is all about how you group things. And we group things using parentheses. So we have a property of addition and multiplication. So if you have multiple things that are added together, you can change how you group them. You'll get the same answer. So you can group the first 2 things together and do that addition first. Or if you want, you can do the last 2 and group those together and add those first. You can change what things you have added together based off of how they're grouped. It's the same thing with the associative property of multiplication. So it only works when you have things that are multiplied. Once you throw a division in there, it doesn't work. But if you have a series of things that are multiplied, you can group them in different ways. You'll get the same answer. So the associative property is all about how they are grouped using parentheses. So I've got 4 examples here where we're going to use the associative property. So the first one, I have 6 plus 7 plus negative 10. So I put negative 10 in parentheses just to indicate that it's a negative there. But I have 6 plus 7 grouped together. If I want to use the associative property of addition, that means that instead of grouping 6 plus 7 together, I could group the 7 plus negative 10. So that would give me, I can first write these without any parentheses, and I could instead group 7 and the negative 10 together with parentheses instead of the 6 plus 7. So that's the associative property. I'm changing which items I have grouped together. So I'm going to just highlight that so you know that that is the answer. Now, the second one that I have on the top right, I have 5 plus 10 minus 12. So once you have that minus, you need to first turn the subtraction into addition before you can use this property. So this is the same as saying 5 plus 10 plus negative 12. Since subtracting is the same as adding a negative. So once you rewrite it, you see that the last 2 are grouped together. So if we want to use the associative property, that means we can change it so that the first 2 are grouped together. So we could rewrite this as 5 plus 10 and group those, and then add the negative 12. So the associative property is all about shifting where your parentheses are, which you can only do if you have everything added or everything multiplied. So now on the bottom row, this is where I have the associative property of multiplication. So first I have 4 times, and then grouped together 5 times negative 2. So with multiplication, here I've got the last 2 things grouped together. So I can shift and move where those parentheses are and group the first 2 instead. And that's the associative property. So that's 4 times 5, and then multiplying by negative 2. I'm going to put just parentheses around the negative 2 so it doesn't look like subtraction. So I just moved where my parentheses were. And you can only do this if you have things that are multiplied. If division is involved, you can't do it. So now the second one on the bottom row, I have 9 times -3 grouped together, and then I multiply by -1. So if I want to move what's grouped together, I can group the -3 times -1 together instead. And so I can do those first and then do the 9 times that. So because everything is multiplication, so you can just slide where your parentheses are. And that's the associative property. So the commutative property, you're flip-flopping the order that it comes in. The associative, you're just moving where the parentheses are. Are there any questions on this slide? Okay, so doing that is not really helpful when you just have numbers, but this is how we simplify things with variables, which are these letters, is we use these properties. So on the top left here, I have -3 plus, and then I have grouped together 5 plus z. So order of operations, I'm going to write this down, is PEMDAS. It says parentheses first. So my parentheses say 5 plus z. But those are not like terms. They're not similar. One's a number, one's a letter. How do you add a number and a letter together? You can't. So I need to use the associative property to move the parentheses where I have grouped together. So I can rearrange this as -3 plus 5 and then plus z. I'm going to make that z look a little better. So I have changed where the parentheses are. That's the associative property. I've just slid them over to the left. Now, if I follow the order of operations, I would have to do -3 plus 5. I can do that. -3 plus 5 gives me 2. So this would give me 2 plus z. And then 2 and z, those are different things. One's a number, one's a letter. You can't add those. So that's your answer. So I've simplified it because I had 3 things, and now I have 2 things. So I have fewer items there. But I can't simplify further because I have a letter, and we can't really add numbers and letters together. Now on the top right here, I have -12 times 4z. So that 4z is really 4 times z. Multiplying a letter by a number, that still doesn't really mean anything to us. But we can use the associative property to kind of rearrange where the parentheses are. So I can move my parentheses to the left to do -12 times 4 instead, and then put the z in the end. So I'm just moving my parentheses so that they're around the numbers. Now I can actually multiply these. So -12 times 4 is -48. So that gives me -48z. And then I can't really do anything else because it doesn't really make sense to multiply a number by a letter. So that's as far as I can go. So that is considered simplified. So both of these I use the associative property. Now I'm going to change this bottom one and rewrite it differently. I'm just flip-flopping stuff. So here I have -5 plus x in parentheses plus 7. And I want to simplify. If I've moved my parentheses to go around the x plus 7, that doesn't help me because I can't add x and 7 together. They're different things. So we're going to use the commutative property first to flip-flop the -5 and the x. So that was what I originally had written. So I can flip-flop these and write x plus -5 instead. I'm going to just put a C there to say that's the commutative property. So here, this was the associative property. This one's the associative property. Now, order of operations, x plus -5, that's in the parentheses, but they're different things. We can't add those. So I'm going to use the associative property to move the parentheses. So instead, I'm going to put the parentheses around the -5 plus 7. So now, if I follow the order of operations, I can simplify in the parentheses because we can do -5 plus 7. So -5 plus 7 is 2. So this gives me x plus 2. And then that's as far as I go because adding a letter and a number together doesn't make sense. So we can't do anything else. So that's our final answer that we have simplified together. Now the bottom right here. So I have -5 and then in parentheses -1/5 times w. So I'm taking a number times a variable. Can't really do that. So I need to shift where my parentheses are again so that I can multiply the numbers instead. So that's the associative property. So I'm going to rewrite this as 5 times -1/5. And then have the w. So I'm just moving my parentheses. So now I want to multiply my -5 times -1/5. So a negative times a negative is a positive. And when you multiply these, we're multiplying fractions here, you multiply straight across. So that would give you 5/5w. And 5/5 is 1, so this is 1w. Which you could just ignore the 1 and just write it as z if you want. I mean, not z, w. I switched the variables on you. You could ignore the 1 and write w. Now, the fact that this simplified and the numbers basically disappeared, that's something that's called the inverse property, and we will talk about that in the next couple slides. But are there any questions on this slide on how I use these properties to make things look a little nicer, or at least a little simpler than where they started? Okay. So next properties, we have the identity property. So that just comes from the word identical, basically. So the identity property of addition is if, oh, that's supposed to be a lowercase a. Otherwise, that doesn't make any sense. Lowercase, those need to match. There. So if you have a lowercase a, you have a plus 0. If you're adding 0 to something, it doesn't do anything. You have the same thing you started with. So a plus 0 is still a. And if you have 0 plus a, you get a. So basically, if you add 0 to a number, your result is identical to that number. That's why it's called the identity. It comes from that word identical. So adding 0 doesn't change anything. You're left with something identical to what you had. So 0 is also called the additive identity. I know these are really weird language, like, you know, this is vocabulary here. Additive identity. It means that when you add, your answer is identical to what you started with. The identity property of multiplication is similar, but you're multiplying. So a times 1 is a. 1 times a gets you a. Multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. anything. Your answer is identical to what it was. So 1 is called the multiplicative identity. This might make more sense with numbers. So if I had like 2 plus 0, if I add 0 to 2, I'm still left with 2. My answer is identical to what I started with. If I multiply 2 by 1, 2 times 1 is still 2. It's still identical. Like 2 is 2. It doesn't change. So those are why those are identity properties. Now we have the inverse property. So lexico.com, it's another different type of dictionary. I actually liked this definition better than the one on dictionary.com. But inverse, if we look at what the word inverse means, it means something that is the opposite or reverse of something else. So that's why this is called the inverse property. Again, this is supposed to be a lowercase. My computer just wants to automatically capitalize the first thing there. So inverse property of addition. So a plus negative a is 0. And negative a plus a is 0. If you're seeing this with numbers, this means 2 plus negative 2. If you take 2 and you're adding a negative version of that number, they cancel out and you're left with 0. So this is called the inverse property because you're adding the opposite. So inverse, something that is the opposite. So the opposite of a positive is a negative. You add the opposites together, you get 0. So you're adding inverses. So that negative version is called the additive inverse, or the opposite of what A is. So if you take a number and you add its opposite, basically same thing, different sign, they cancel out, you're left with 0. Then with multiplication, we have the inverse property of multiplication. So if I have b and I multiply by 1 over b, they cancel, I'm left with 1. And the order doesn't matter. If I have 1 over b times b, they still cancel, they're equal to 1. So 1 over b is called the multiplicative inverse, or the reciprocal. So the inverse in terms of multiplication is the reciprocal. It's flip-flopped, basically. So that's where you can think of it's the reverse. So like if we have, let's just do it with fractions. If I have 3 over 4, if I want to sort of reverse 3 over 4, it would make sense to kind of flip-flop where the numbers are, 4 over 3. If you do that and you multiply them together, you're going to get 1. So those are inverses because they're sort of their reciprocals. So we use the word opposite and reverse. The opposite is with addition. And then you can think of the reverse with multiplication. They're just telling you how to cancel things out. If you want to cancel with addition, you add the opposite. You have opposite signs. If you want to cancel something out with multiplication, then you have to multiply by the reciprocal. So those are, we use these properties when we start solving. We usually don't write the name of it, but these rules are how we're able to solve equations. So this is just all vocabulary stuff. The next property that you actually do anything with is the distributive property. So if we look up the word distribute, because I use that term again, I say distribute, so you want to know what that means. It says gives shares of something, deal out. So like if somebody says distribute this to your classmates or to your coworkers, you give everybody one of them. You're giving everybody a piece. And so that's really the idea behind the distributive property. It shouldn't say of addition, it's of multiplication over addition. Usually we just shortchange it as distributive property over addition. No one uses that full name. But basically, if you're multiplying things together, everything gets a share. That's one way to think about it. So this is when we have things with parentheses. I have something outside these parentheses, and I'm multiplying it by something inside the parentheses. If we want to look at with numbers, so let's say I have 2 times 5 plus 7. You can think of these people or something. Maybe there's somebody named 5, somebody with 7 or whatever, and you want to share that 2 among them. So everybody gets a share of that 2. You multiply them together. So you multiply 2 times the 5, and you multiply 2 times the 7. That's what the distributive property means, is that whatever's outside those parentheses gets multiplied by everything inside the parentheses. And you'll get the same answer here. If we follow the order of operations on the left, 5 plus 7 is 12.
No, I didn't say that.
So we would have 2 times 12, and 2 times 12 is 24. If instead we distribute, and then we do the right side, and then you multiply, 2 times 5 is 10, 2 times 7 is 14, 10 plus 14 is 24. So you get the same answer. So it's just another way of writing it, but they're equivalent. They mean the same thing. And it's the same thing if you go the other way. Like if you have that C in the back on that second line, I can multiply backwards as well. And that's allowed. So that's what the distributive property means. It's just you multiply everything inside the parentheses by what is outside the parentheses. This would be best seen with examples here. So I've got 6 examples. They're involving variables. This is sort of simplifying here, but I'm going to show you how it works. So I'm going to start, we're just rewriting these. We're not necessarily simplifying, we just want to rewrite. For the first one here, I have 2, and then x plus 7 inside the parentheses. So the process is distributing. So first I do 2 times x, and I'm going to just literally write that, 2 times x. And I use parentheses when I'm indicating that I'm multiplying. Then I'm going to do 2 times 7, and you always put a plus sign in between these. So that I'm doing 2 times 7. So I use the distributive property to rewrite this. I just took what was on the outside, and I have multiplied it by everything on the inside. If we want to simplify, we can go one step forward by actually doing any multiplication. Like 2 times x doesn't mean anything, so I can just write 2x, but 2 times 7, I can do that, and that gives me 14. So you can actually do the multiplication. And so it's just a different way of writing it without parentheses. You just kind of, that 2 gets shared among everything. So it's the same idea on the top right here. I have a -3 and then in parentheses 2z plus 9. So I need to multiply everything inside the parentheses by that -3. So first I do -3 times 2z. And then I have an addition sign. Then I have to take that -3 and multiply it by 9. So both the 2z and the 9 got multiplied by -3. And then you'd want to try to simplify this further. So I showed you that we can do the associative property, where you can rearrange your parentheses here. So we can do -3 times 2 instead of -3 times, and then 2 times z. So we can rewrite that. And then I should have given myself one more line of work, so I'll just go to the right here. So -3 times 2 is a -6, so I can have a -6z. So I can actually do the multiplication. And then -3 times 9 is -27. So that's plus -27. So a lot of the time the multiplication, I just do in my head. I don't show all of these steps, but if, you know, it's really good to start off by showing all of these steps until you get used to what's going on, because that will help you see the patterns and it will help you see what the steps are. And then you can start doing this in your head as you get more practice. Now, let's look at the second row. I have negative and then in parentheses 7q plus 1. So that negative gets distributed. It's a negative times each thing in parentheses. So I have a negative times the 7q, and then I'm going to put a plus sign, and then I have a negative times the 1. Now the negative just says, okay, I'm taking the opposite. So if I have a negative in front of my 7q is positive, so now I have a negative 7q. And then the opposite of 1 is a positive 1 is negative 1, so I have plus negative 1. So basically, you're just switching the signs. If you have a negative out front, you're just making everything inside the parentheses the opposite. So if it was positive, it becomes negative. And then I can't add q, something with q and then a number together, because that doesn't really mean anything. So that's where you leave it. So now let's take a look at 4, and then in parentheses, w minus 13z. So first we have to do 4 times w, and then plus, and then that minus is going to be included as with negative, we're going to think of that as a negative 13 there. So that's going to be 4 times negative 13z. So if you have a minus in there, just stick it with the number, or if it's in front of a variable, stick it with what follows it, and think of those together, and then you still have a plus in between. So 4 times w doesn't mean anything, so we just keep that written the way it is. But now we want to use the associative property so that we can multiply the 4 and the negative 13 by grouping those together instead of the negative 13 and the z. Because negative 13 times a letter doesn't mean anything, but 4 times negative 13 does. So again, I didn't leave myself enough room here. So I'm going to just go to the right here. So I have 4w plus, then I do the multiplication, 4 times negative 13. That is negative 52. So then I have negative 52z. The letters just hang out. A lot of people, you know, think, oh my goodness, we've got these letters, what do we do with them? You don't really do anything with them. They just kind of hang out, and you just work with the numbers. And then the letter just tags along for the ride. Now the last one's here. So I have a negative 6, and so now I need to first multiply that by a. So I have a negative 6 times a. Then I'm going to put a parenthesis. Then I have negative 6. And then that's going to be read as a negative b. That minus sign is going to go with what comes next. And then I need to multiply by the c, so that's plus negative 6 times c. So there's 3 things in the parentheses, so those 3 things all get multiplied by negative 6. And I just write parentheses to help me keep track. Or I mean write the arrows. It just helps me keep track of where I'm at. So now negative 6 times a really can't do anything with that, so we just write that as negative 6a. Plus, now a negative 6 times a negative b. We can do a negative times a negative. Negative times a negative is a positive. So basically those negatives cancel out, so I'm left with 6b. And then I have a negative 6 times c, which I can't really do anything with, so I just have negative 6c. Now, the last one here. I have a negative in front, and then I'm multiplying that by a negative p minus 5q minus 10r. So I'm distributing. I have a negative, and then my negative p. And then I need to multiply, so first I need to have a plus sign in between each of these. Then I have my negative sign, and then that's going to be a negative 5q. So that minus sign goes with the 5q. Now I have to write a plus sign. Then I take that negative and I need to multiply it by that minus 10r. So I'm going to put my negative sign, and then that minus sign has to get attached to the 10r. So now I have a negative times a negative. Those cancel. Negative times a negative is a positive. So those disappear. Those cancel out, and I'm just left with p. They basically they did the opposite of a negative is a positive. They just disappear. Now I have a negative times negative 5. The opposite of negative 5 is a positive 5. So I could just write this as 5q. Basically, those two negative signs cancel out when you're multiplying. Then again, I have the opposite of a negative 10. The opposite of a negative is a positive. They cancel out, so that gives me a positive 10r. So if you have a negative sign in front, you're basically just changing all of the signs and flip-flop, just changing everything that was negative to a positive. Anything that is positive then becomes negative. You're just flipping everything. Are there any questions on these examples? Okay. So, oops. From here, I recommend you watch the video on variables and expressions. So that is in the classroom. This PowerPoint, this is actually a link to, like, you can push this video if you downloaded the PowerPoint and it will play it directly. So that's where I would recommend you go from here, is then after you've seen this, watch that video, because then it's going to talk more about the vocabulary, and it's going to talk about how we use those properties, and we're going to be simplifying things further. So that's like the next step from here. So are there any questions in general on anything? Okay, you guys are a quiet bunch today. Hopefully this was helpful to help you kind of go over the vocabulary and kind of see how things are. This is like the most, like, I'm trying to break things down as simple as possible so you can see step by step. If you have questions, let's see, tomorrow, I'm not going to be checking my email at all tomorrow, but I will be on Remind. So if you have questions, you can contact me and Remind. Good, I explained it well. That's good. That is good to know, because I don't want you guys to be like, whoa, I just had no idea what happened. So I'm glad. But if you do end up having questions, contact me via Remind tomorrow. Otherwise, if you send me an email, I will be responding to that on Sunday. This evening, Friday nights, I usually say I'm not working. You know, got to have some sort of evening where you don't do anything. So don't expect to hear back really much from anything from me tonight, but those are the two ways to contact me, is through Remind tomorrow or email, and I'll get back to you on Sunday. And then next time I'm doing a live is Wednesday. You guys have an evening one this time around, because I said that I wanted to make sure that everybody's gets a chance to be, you know, have some evening times. So I'm trying to get my calendar up. Yeah, I have too many windows open. Where? Oh, maybe I must have accidentally closed my calendar. I'm like, I thought I had it open. Let me open that back up just to make sure. I think I put you guys at 5. Let me see. Yes. So 5 o'clock on Wednesday. So you guys have an evening time Wednesday, and then hopefully the following week I'll try you guys at 7. I just want to make sure everybody has a chance. So I'm just kind of rotating people through. So there should be, I've got plenty of videos for week 2 on what you're going through this week. So if you follow up this video with those, you should be in good shape for everything that you're doing this week. But of course, you know, you can ask me questions at any time. So I hope you have a really great Friday, that you guys have a great weekend, that the weather is nice and you can, you know, take some breaks. Don't spend 5 hours in a row doing math. Definitely take some breaks. I don't want you guys to overload your brain, because if you overload your brain, then you're not really learning anything. Your brain can't handle it, you know. So then it's not useful. So take breaks, have some fun. You know, don't just spend all weekend on math or your other classes without having some sort of fun. So, all right. Well, I'm going to get off and then make sure I get this all processed and out to you guys, the recording shortly. So I will talk to you guys later.